A scared little girl watched a thief breaking into her father's car. When the entire police department heard what she did next, they couldn't hold back their tears. Sarah Johnson stood at the window of apartment 304, her small hands pressed against the cold glass. Outside, the Detroit morning crawled across the cracked parking lot where her father's old Ford sat between faded yellow lines. The sun hadn't risen yet, but Officer Marcus Johnson was already buckling his duty belt, the leather creaking in the quiet apartment. "You watching that car again, baby?" Marcus's deep voice carried from the kitchen, followed by the sound of coffee pouring into his thermos. "Someone could break in, Daddy." Sarah's breath fogged the window. She wiped it away with her sleeve, her eyes fixed on the Ford. "Mrs. Thompson said they broke into Mr. Garcia's car last week." Heavy footsteps approached, and Marcus's reflection appeared behind her in the glass. "That's why we look out for each other, right?" Sarah nodded, her colorful braids bobbing. She turned to face her father, taking in his crisp blue uniform, the badge that caught the dim light from the kitchen. At 11 years old, she knew every detail of his morning routine. The way he checked his gear twice, how he always filled his thermos to the exact same level, the particular way he straightened his collar. "I made your lunch," she said, pointing to the brown paper bag on the counter. "Turkey sandwich, no mayo, extra mustard." Marcus smiled, the kind of smile that made the corners of his eyes crinkle. "What would I do without my little guardian angel?" The word guardian stuck in Sarah's throat. 5 years ago, her mother had called her that just hours before the car accident. The memory hit her like it always did, sudden and sharp, like a door slamming shut. "Hey." Marcus knelt down, his gun belt jingling. "What's wrong?" "Nothing." Sarah forced a smile, but her father knew better. He always knew. "Missing Mom?" She nodded, and he pulled her into a hug. The rough fabric of his uniform scratched her cheek, but she didn't mind. It smelled like safety, leather and coffee, and the laundry detergent she helped him buy at the discount store. "I found something yesterday," Marcus said, standing up. He walked to his bedroom, and Sarah heard him moving things around. When he returned, he held a small metal box. "Been meaning to show you this." Sarah recognized it, the emergency fund box he kept in his closet. She'd seen him counting bills late at night, when he thought she was asleep. "Come here." He sat at their small kitchen table, patting the chair beside him. Sarah climbed up, her feet dangling above the linoleum floor. Marcus opened the box, revealing neat stacks of bills and a folder of documents. "See this?" He pulled out a bank statement. "Every month, I put away a little something. For your college fund." Sarah's eyes widened at the number. "That's a lot of money, Daddy." "Not enough yet." He tucked the statement away. "But we'll get there. That's why we stay here in this apartment. Every dollar we save on rent is another dollar for your future." A car alarm went off somewhere in the distance, making them both look toward the window. Marcus's hand instinctively moved to his hip. "Daddy." Sarah's voice got small. "I saw someone looking at cars yesterday. A man in a black jacket." Marcus's expression hardened. "What time?" "After school. He was walking slow, looking in windows." "Did he see you?" Sarah shook her head. "I was hiding behind Mrs. Thompson's plants." "Good girl?" Marcus checked his watch. "Listen, I need you to be extra careful today. If you see anything, call you right away," Sarah finished. "And stay inside." "That's right." He stood, grabbing his thermos and lunch. "Mrs. Thompson will check on you after school. Don't open the door for anyone else." Sarah followed him to the apartment door, their morning goodbye ritual as familiar as breathing. She watched him check his gear one last time. Gun, radio, handcuffs, spare magazine. "Daddy." She grabbed his hand before he could reach for the doorknob. "Be careful today." Marcus squeezed her hand. "Always am, baby. Always am." The door closed behind him, and Sarah listened to his footsteps echo down the hallway. She returned to her post at the window, watching as he emerged into the parking lot. The sky was getting lighter now, turning the puddles from yesterday's rain into mirrors. Marcus paused at the Ford, checking the doors like he did every morning. Sarah held her breath until he finished his inspection. Only when he pulled out of the parking lot did she let herself move away from the window. She had 2 hours before school, and she knew exactly how she'd spend them. First, she checked all the locks, door, windows, even the small window in the bathroom that didn't open all the way. Then she pulled her backpack from beside the couch and checked her homework one more time. The apartment felt different when she was alone. Every creak and groan of the old building seemed louder. The shadows in the corners grew longer. But Sarah had learned to live with the silence, to fill it with routines and responsibilities. She pulled a chair to the kitchen counter and reached for the cereal box on the top shelf. As she poured her breakfast, a movement in the parking lot caught her eye. She froze, milk carton hovering above the bowl. A man in a dark jacket was walking between the cars. Sarah's heart jumped into her throat. She set the milk down carefully, trying not to make a sound, even though she knew he couldn't possibly hear her from 3 floors up. The man moved with a purpose, his head turning from side to side as he passed each vehicle. She fumbled for her father's number on the emergency phone he'd given her, but before she could dial, the man walked out of the lot and disappeared around the corner. Sarah's hands were shaking as she put the phone down. The rest of her morning routine felt like a performance, getting dressed, brushing her teeth, packing her school bag. Her mind kept drifting to the man in the parking lot, to her father's Ford sitting there like a target. When it was time to leave for school, Sarah took one last look around the apartment. The lunch dishes were washed and put away. Her bed was made. Everything was in its place, just the way her father liked it. At the door, she paused. "I'll keep watch, Mom," she whispered to the empty apartment. "I promise." She locked the door behind her, tested the handle twice, and headed for the stairs. The morning sun was streaming through the grimy windows of the stairwell, casting long shadows that danced as she descended. Each step took her closer to the parking lot, where she'd have to pass her father's car. Their most valuable possession, the last piece of their family's better days. Sarah pushed open the heavy door to the outside, squinting in the brightness. The Ford sat exactly where it had been all morning, its dented fender catching the light. She walked past it quickly, her backpack bouncing against her spine, already planning how she'd check on it as soon as she got home from school. Being her father's guardian wasn't always easy, but it was the most important job she had. And today, something in her gut told her it was more important than ever. The afternoon sun beat down on the parking lot as Sarah dragged her jump rope across the cracked asphalt. School had ended an hour ago, and the concrete walls of the apartment building trapped the heat like an oven. She stopped next to her father's Ford, running her hand along its warm metal surface. "You checking on that car again, child?" Mrs. Thompson's voice carried from the second-floor window. The old woman's gray head poked out, her glasses glinting in the sunlight. "Yes, ma'am." Sarah wrapped her jump rope around her wrist. "Daddy says we have to watch out for each other." "Your daddy's right about that." Mrs. Thompson's face darkened, especially after what happened to poor Mr. Garcia's car. They took everything, even his daughter's car seat. Sarah's stomach tightened. She looked at her father's Ford. The peeling paint, the small dent in the rear bumper from when Mom had backed into a pole at the grocery store. Inside the glove compartment, there was still a half-empty pack of mint gum that Mom used to chew. "They won't get Daddy's car," Sarah said, more to herself than to Mrs. Thompson. "I won't let them." The rope slapped against the pavement as Sarah started jumping. 1, 2, 3. She counted in her head, remembering how her mom used to jump with her right here in this same spot. "Higher, baby." Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "That's my girl." The Ford had been newer then, its blue paint still shiny. They'd go for drives on Sundays, all 3 of them, with the windows down and music playing. Her mother would sing along to old Motown songs, and her father would pretend to complain, but end up joining in. A car door slammed somewhere in the lot, making Sarah stumble. Her rope caught on her ankle, and she had to grab the Ford to keep from falling. "You okay there, honey?" Mrs. Thompson called down. "Yes, ma'am." Sarah straightened up, scanning the lot. A man she didn't recognize was walking between the cars, hands in his pockets. Her heart rate picked up. Was it the same man from this morning? "Mrs. Thompson?" Sarah backed toward the building. "There's a man. I see him." The old woman's voice turned sharp. "Get inside, child. Right now." Sarah gathered her rope, but didn't move yet. The man stopped at Mr. Wilson's Toyota, peering through the windows. He wore a dark jacket despite the heat. "Sarah Johnson," Mrs. Thompson hissed. "Inside." The man's head snapped up at Mrs. Thompson's voice. Sarah caught a glimpse of his face, young, with a thin mustache and cold eyes. He stared at her for a long moment before walking away, his shoes scraping against the asphalt. Sarah's legs felt wobbly as she hurried inside. The stairwell was dark and cool, smelling of old cigarettes and pine sol. She took the steps two at a time, her jump rope trailing behind her like a snake. Mrs. Thompson was waiting in the hallway, her house dress wrinkled and her feet in fuzzy slippers. "Come here, baby." She held out her arms, and Sarah ran into them. "You did good getting inside quick like that." "Was that him?" Sarah's voice shook. "The one who broke into Mr. Garcia's car?" "Could be." Mrs. Thompson stroked Sarah's braids. "They've been hitting all the buildings in the area. Your daddy knows about it. The whole police department's been working on it." Sarah pulled back, wiping her eyes. "I should call him." "Let's wait." Mrs. Thompson took her hand. "Man's gone now, and your daddy's got enough on his mind. Come on." I made lemonade. Inside Mrs. Thompson's apartment, everything smelled like lavender and butter cookies. Sarah sat at the kitchen table while the old woman poured them both tall glasses of lemonade. "Now then," Mrs. Thompson settled into her chair with a grunt. "Tell me what you saw this morning." Sarah described the man she'd spotted earlier, how he'd walked through the lot looking into cars. As she talked, she kept glancing out Mrs. Thompson's window, which had a clear view of her father's Ford. "Same jacket?" Mrs. Thompson asked. "I think so." Sarah twisted her jump rope around her fingers. "But I couldn't see his face good this morning." A police siren wailed in the distance, and both of them turned toward the sound. Sarah's hand went to the emergency phone in her pocket. No messages from her father. "Your daddy's a good man," Mrs. Thompson said suddenly. "Works hard to keep us all safe." "That car of his?" She shook her head. "It ain't just a car, is it?" "No, ma'am." Sarah's throat felt tight. "It's Mom's, too." Mrs. Thompson reached across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand. "I remember her. Always smiling, that woman. Used to bring me soup when my arthritis was acting up." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She could see the Ford from here, sitting alone in its spot. The sun had moved, casting long shadows across the lot. "Mrs. Thompson?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "What if they come back?" The old woman's face hardened. "Then we'll be ready. I've got your daddy's number right here by my phone. And I got sharp eyes, baby. Real sharp eyes." They sat in silence for a while, watching the parking lot through the window. Sarah finished her lemonade, the sweet tart taste reminding her of summer afternoons before everything changed, when her mom would make fresh lemonade and they'd sit in the Ford with the AC running, pretending they were at a drive-in movie. "I should go upstairs," Sarah said finally. "Got homework to do? I'll walk you up." Mrs. Thompson stood slowly, her joints cracking. These old legs need the exercise anyway. At Sarah's door, Mrs. Thompson waited while she unlocked it and checked inside. The apartment was empty and quiet, just as she'd left it. "Remember," Mrs. Thompson said, "any trouble at all, you bang on my door or call your daddy. Don't try to be brave on your own." "Yes, ma'am." Sarah hugged the old woman. "Thank you for the lemonade." Inside, Sarah went straight to the window. The parking lot was filling up as people returned from work, but her father's spot remained empty. 3 more hours until his shift ended. She unzipped her backpack and pulled out her math homework, but her eyes kept drifting to the window. The man in the dark jacket was out there somewhere. Maybe watching, maybe waiting. Sarah pulled her chair closer to the window. She had homework to do, but she also had a job, keeping watch over her father's car, over the last piece of her mother they had left. The sun continued its slow descent, turning the parking lot into a maze of shadows. Sarah sat at her post, homework forgotten, watching every movement below. In her pocket, the emergency phone felt heavy, ready to be used at a moment's notice. A cool breeze blew through the lot, making the trees rustle. Sarah shivered, not from the cold, but from the certainty settling in her gut. Something was going to happen. Soon. And when it did, she would be ready. The streetlights flickered on one by one as Sarah pressed her forehead against the cool window glass. Her math homework lay unfinished on the table, pencil rolling toward the edge with each vibration from the passing trucks outside. Her father wouldn't be home for another hour. Movement caught her eye, a shadow sliding between parked cars. Sarah's breath hitched. The figure emerged under a streetlight, dark jacket, thin mustache. The same man. Her hand shook as she reached for the emergency phone. Then she stopped. What would she tell her father? That she saw someone walking? He'd tell her to stay inside, just like always. But something felt different this time. The man wasn't just walking. He was studying. Each car he passed got a long look. He'd stop, peer inside, then move on, getting closer to her father's Ford with each step. Sarah's mouth went dry. Her father's voice echoed in her head from last week's lecture about situational awareness. "Watch their hands, baby," he'd said while cleaning his service weapon at the kitchen table. "Hands tell you everything you need to know." The man's right hand kept dipping into his jacket pocket. In, out, like he was checking something. A door slammed somewhere in the building. Sarah jumped, her knee banging against the wall. The man's head snapped up toward the sound, then swiveled toward her window. She ducked, heart hammering against her ribs. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. She counted like her father taught her, trying to slow her breathing. When she finally peered out again, the man had moved closer to her father's car. "Please no," she whispered, fogging the glass. Mrs. Thompson's window light was off. The old woman usually watched her evening shows until 9, but tonight her apartment was dark. The whole building felt darker, quieter. The man stopped 2 cars away from the Ford. His hand came out of his pocket holding something that caught the streetlight's glare. Metal. Sarah's fingers found her father's number on speed dial. Her thumb hovered over the call button. But before she could press it, another car pulled into the lot, headlights sweeping across the scene. The man melted into the shadows between vehicles. Sarah held her breath, watching the new car park. Mr. Rodriguez from the first floor stepped out, carrying his work backpack. He walked right past where the man was hiding, keys jingling. "Mr. Rodriguez," Sarah whispered, willing him to look around, to notice. But he just kept walking, head down, disappearing into the building's entrance. The man reappeared, closer now. Only one car separated him from the Ford. The metal thing in his hand caught the light again, some kind of tool. Sarah's throat felt like she'd swallowed sand. She should call her father, should scream, should do something, but her body wouldn't move. A police siren wailed in the distance. The man froze, head cocked like a dog listening. Sarah prayed it was her father coming home early. The siren grew louder, then faded, heading somewhere else. The man relaxed, rolling his shoulders. He took another step toward the Ford. Sarah's legs finally unlocked. She stumbled back from the window, bumping into the kitchen table. Her math textbook hit the floor with a thud that seemed to echo through the whole apartment. Think, she muttered, pacing. Her father's training sessions played through her head like a jumbled movie. "Always have a plan," his voice lectured in her memory. "Know your exits. Know your safe spots." She ran to the apartment door, checking the locks again. Then to her bedroom window, locked. Bathroom window, locked. Back to the kitchen window. The man was at her father's car now, running his hand along the driver's side door. Testing. Sarah's chest felt too tight. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. She forced herself to take deep breaths like her father taught her. "When you're scared," he'd said, "your body wants to panic. Don't let it. Breathe. Think. Act." She pressed her back against the wall beside the window, trying to make herself as small as possible while still keeping the Ford in view. The emergency phone felt slick in her sweaty palm. The man looked around one last time, scanning the building's windows. Sarah held perfectly still. After what felt like hours, he turned back to the car. His hand came out of his pocket again. This time she saw the tool clearly, long and thin with a curved end. He crouched by the driver's door, and Sarah heard a faint scraping sound carrying up through the night air. Her father's words from countless safety talks swirled in her head. "If you see something wrong, get somewhere safe and call for help. Don't try to be a hero." But the Ford wasn't just a car. It was Saturday morning drives with her mom singing. It was her father's tired smile when he came home from work. It was the last thing they had that belonged to all three of them. The scraping sound got louder. The man shifted his position, and Sarah saw his face clearly in the streetlight, concentrated, determined. He wasn't going to stop. Her legs trembled as she stood. The emergency phone nearly slipped from her grip, and she clutched it tighter. She needed to do something. Now. But what if she was wrong? What if the man had a reason to be there? Her father would be angry if she called in a false alarm. The man straightened suddenly, looking over his shoulder. Sarah ducked again, counting her heartbeats. When she looked back, he had something new in his hand, bigger, heavier. Time slowed down. Sarah watched him draw back his arm, the metal tool glinting. Her body moved before her brain could catch up, legs carrying her toward the apartment door. She had to get help, had to stop him, had to protect the car, had to... The sound of breaking glass shattered the night. Sarah's hand found the doorknob. The metal was cold against her palm, grounding her. This was it. No more watching. No more hiding. Her father's voice echoed one last time in her head. Sometimes being brave means being scared but doing the right thing anyway. Sarah took a deep breath, turned the handle, and stepped into the hallway. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she began to run, her footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. She didn't know exactly what she was going to do, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let anyone take away their last piece of mom. Not tonight. Not ever. The sound of shattering glass ripped through the night air. Sarah froze halfway down the hallway, her bare feet sticking to the cold linoleum floor. Another crack followed, the man clearing away the remaining glass from the window frame. Her father's training kicked in. If you hear breaking glass, don't investigate. Get somewhere safe. Call 911, but her feet wouldn't move towards safety. The emergency phone shook in her hand as she crept toward the stairwell door. Through the small rectangular window, she could see the parking lot 3 floors below. The man was already halfway inside the Ford, his legs still sticking out the driver's side window. Glass glittered on the pavement around the car like scattered diamonds under the streetlight. "Stop," Sarah whispered, but no sound came out. Her throat had closed up tight. A door opened somewhere behind her. Mrs. Thompson shuffled into the hallway in her floral nightgown, TV noise spilling out behind her. "Sarah?" The old woman squinted. "What are you?" Sarah pressed her finger to her lips frantically. Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened, and she hobbled closer. "Someone's in Daddy's car," Sarah managed to squeak out. Mrs. Thompson peered through the stairwell window. The man had disappeared completely inside the Ford now. The sound of items being thrown around carried faintly up to them. "Lord have mercy," Mrs. Thompson breathed. "Call your father, child. Right now." Sarah's fingers trembled as she tried to hit the speed dial. The phone slipped, clattering on the floor. When she grabbed it, the screen was black. "It's dead," she choked out. "I forgot to charge it." "Use mine." Mrs. Thompson patted her nightgown pockets. "Oh, Lord, it's in my apartment. Below." The man was tearing through the glove compartment. Papers flew everywhere inside the car. Sarah's mother's insurance cards, registration, the small notebook where she used to write down gas mileage, all scattered like confetti. "The box," Sarah gasped. Daddy's metal box. She'd seen her father hide it under the driver's seat that morning after showing her the college fund. The man would find it if he kept searching. Mrs. Thompson grabbed Sarah's arm. "Stay here. I'll get my phone." But Sarah barely heard her. The man was reaching under the driver's seat now, his movements becoming more focused. Any second he would feel the metal box. "All our savings," Sarah whispered. "Mom's things." Her body moved on its own. Before Mrs. Thompson could stop her, she yanked open the stairwell door and started down the stairs. "Sarah Johnson." Mrs. Thompson's harsh whisper followed her. "Get back here." Sarah's feet slapped against the concrete steps. In her head, her father's voice battled with her racing thoughts. "Never confront a suspect," his training voice lectured. Another crash from the parking lot. "Get to safety," the voice insisted. The sound of papers ripping. "Call for help." Metal scraping against metal. The box being pulled out. Sarah hit the second-floor landing, her lungs burning. Above her, Mrs. Thompson was shouting something, but the words were lost in the thunder of blood rushing through Sarah's ears. First floor. The heavy fire door loomed in front of her. Through its window, she could see the Ford clearly now. The man's feet had reappeared, planted on the glass-covered pavement as he leaned in deeper, hunting. Sarah's hand touched the door handle. The metal was ice-cold against her palm. "What are you doing?" her father's voice demanded in her head. "Protecting our family," she answered silently. She pulled the door open. The night air hit her like a slap. carrying the sharp smell of motor oil and broken glass. 20 feet away, the man was still focused on his search, muttering curses that carried clearly in the still air. Come on, he growled. Where is it? Sarah's voice came out as barely a whisper. Get away from our car. The man didn't hear her. He shifted position, and something fell from his jacket pocket. A small flashlight. It rolled under the car. Damn it. He stretched out further, reaching for it. Sarah took one step forward, then another. Glass crunched under her feet, but the sound was lost under the man's frustrated grunting. She was halfway to the car when he found the metal box. The scrape of it coming out from under the seat was like fingernails on a chalkboard. Finally, he breathed, pulling himself out of the window with the box clutched to his chest. That's when Sarah found her voice. Help! The scream ripped from her throat, echoing off the concrete walls of the apartment building. Someone stealing from my daddy's car. The man spun around, the box dropping from his hands. It hit the pavement with a clang, popping open. Bills scattered in the light breeze. Shut up! He took a step toward her, glass crunching under his boots. Shut up right now! But Sarah couldn't stop. All the fear, all the anger, all the memories of her mother burst out of her in a single, continuous scream that seemed to fill the entire parking lot. Windows started lighting up in the apartment building. Doors opened. More voices joined the chaos. Hey, what's going on? Someone call the police. The man looked up at the growing crowd of faces in the windows, then back at Sarah. His hand twitched toward his jacket pocket. Don't move. A new voice boomed from the stairwell. Mr. Rodriguez stood in the doorway, holding a baseball bat. Police are on their way. The man's face twisted. He grabbed a handful of scattered bills from the ground and turned to run. His foot caught on a piece of the Ford's broken window, and he stumbled. More neighbors were pouring out of the building now. Mrs. Thompson's voice carried over the commotion, shouting into a phone. Yes, apartment complex on Detroit Avenue. Hurry! Sarah's legs finally gave out. She sat down hard on the pavement, glass crunching under her. The man disappeared between the buildings, taking some of their savings with him. But he left most of it behind. The metal box lay on its side, papers and bills still spilling out. Through the broken window of the Ford, she could see her mother's old notebook, somehow untouched in all the chaos. Hands grabbed her shoulders. Mrs. Thompson was there, wrapping her in a tight hug. You foolish, brave girl, the old woman's voice cracked. What were you thinking? Sarah couldn't answer. Her throat was raw from screaming. In the distance, sirens began to wail. Mr. Rodriguez and some other neighbors were picking up the scattered money and documents, carefully placing everything back in the metal box. Others were taking pictures of the broken window with their phones. Your daddy's going to have a heart attack, Mrs. Thompson muttered, stroking Sarah's braids. Running down here like that could have been killed, but Sarah barely heard her. Her eyes were fixed on the Ford, on the broken glass that glittered like stars around it. She hadn't saved it from being damaged, hadn't stopped the man completely. The sirens grew louder. She had failed to protect the car, failed to keep safe like her father taught her, failed to. Red and blue lights swept across the parking lot as the first police car turned in. Through her tears, Sarah recognized the vehicle. It was her father's patrol car. The patrol car's headlights blazed across the parking lot, catching Sarah in their glare. Her father's silhouette appeared in the driver's seat, rigid and alert. She could tell the exact moment he recognized their Ford's broken window. His body jerked like he'd been shocked. Marcus! Mrs. Thompson called out, still holding Sarah. Over here! The patrol car door flew open. Officer Marcus Johnson exploded out, his hand on his holstered weapon. His eyes swept the scene, the scattered glass, the broken window, the small crowd of neighbors, before locking onto Sarah. Baby! His voice cracked. Are you hurt? Sarah tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't work. Glass tinkled as she shifted on the pavement. She ran down here by herself, Mrs. Thompson explained, her voice shaking. Screamed bloody murder when she saw him in your car. Marcus dropped to his knees beside Sarah, hands running over her arms, checking for injuries. What were you thinking? You could have, he stopped, noticing her bare feet among the glass. Jesus, baby! The box, Sarah managed to say. He was going to take your box? Marcus looked at the metal container Mr. Rodriguez was still guarding. His face hardened. Which way did he go? Several neighbors pointed toward the back of the complex. Marcus grabbed his radio, voice shifting into cop mode. This is Officer Johnson. Suspect headed east through Granado Apartments. Male, dark jacket, possibly armed. I need units on 23rd and Malcolm. Static crackled. Copy that. Units responding. More sirens approached. Marcus turned back to Sarah, his face a battle between fear and fury. I had to, she whispered before he could speak. It was Mom's car. The anger drained from his face. He pulled her into a tight hug, his uniform buttons pressing into her cheek. Officer Johnson, a new voice called. More patrol cars were pulling in. Detective Rivera, her father's partner, jumped out of one. We've got movement behind the laundromat. Marcus pulled back, looking into Sarah's eyes. Stay with Mrs. Thompson. I mean at this time, but no buts. He stood, checking his weapon. I have to go catch this guy. Promise me you'll stay put. Sarah nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. Marcus squeezed her shoulder one last time before running toward his partner. Mrs. Thompson helped Sarah to her feet, carefully avoiding the glass. Let's get you inside, child. Your feet are bleeding. They were halfway to the building when Sarah heard the first shout from behind the laundromat. Then another. Running feet. A crash. Stop. Police. Her father's voice, stronger than she'd ever heard it. More crashes. Something metal falling. Then, the sound of a gunshot cracked through the night. Sarah's heart stopped. Mrs. Thompson's grip tightened on her arm. Daddy? The word came out as a whimper. Silence stretched for 3 eternal seconds. Suspect in custody. Detective Rivera's voice finally called. Officer Johnson is okay. Sarah's legs gave out again. Mrs. Thompson caught her before she hit the ground. Lord above, the old woman breathed. Let's get you upstairs before anything else happens. They made it to Mrs. Thompson's first-floor apartment. The old woman sat Sarah on her floral couch and disappeared into the bathroom, returning with a first aid kit. Hold still now. She started picking glass from Sarah's feet with tweezers. What possessed you to run down there barefoot? Sarah winced as a particularly deep shard came out. I couldn't let him take it. Take what? That old car. Mrs. Thompson dabbed antiseptic on the cuts. Cars can be replaced, child. You can't. Not this one. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Mom picked it out. She said blue was Daddy's color. We were all there when they handed over the keys. She let me sit in the driver's seat and pretend to drive. Mrs. Thompson's hands stilled. Oh, baby girl. Outside, radio static and voices filled the parking lot. Sarah could hear her father giving orders, coordinating with other officers. He was okay. He was alive. Your mama would be proud, Mrs. Thompson said suddenly. Scared half to death for you, but proud. Sarah looked up. Really? Standing up for family like that? That's what she always did. Mrs. Thompson wrapped Sarah's left foot in gauze. Remember when those boys were picking on you at the playground? Your mama marched right up to their parents. A ghost of a smile touched Sarah's lips. She made them apologize. That she did. Mrs. Thompson started on the right foot. But she wouldn't want you putting yourself in danger. Not ever. Heavy boots approached the apartment door. A sharp knock. Sarah? Her father's voice. You in there? Mrs. Thompson called out. Come in, Marcus. Just finishing up with her feet. The door opened. Marcus stood in the doorway, his uniform dusty from the chase. A scratch ran down his cheek. Daddy! Sarah tried to stand, but Mrs. Thompson held her down. Stay put until I finish these bandages, the old woman ordered. Marcus crossed the room in 3 strides, dropping into the armchair across from them. Got him, he said simply. Found your college fund money in his pocket. The car, Sarah started. Rivera's calling a guy who can fix the window tonight. Marcus ran a hand over his face. But that's not what matters right now. We need to talk about what you did. Sarah's stomach clenched. Her father's disappointed face was worse than any punishment. I know it was dangerous, she said quickly. I know I should have stayed upstairs. But he was taking your box, and I couldn't, Sarah. Marcus's voice was tight. He had a knife. The room went silent except for Mrs. Thompson's sharp intake of breath. When we caught him, Marcus continued, He pulled a knife. If you had gotten any closer to that car, he couldn't finish the sentence. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. She hadn't seen a knife, hadn't even thought about weapons. All she'd seen was someone trying to take away a piece of her mother. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Marcus leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I know why you did it, but baby, that car? It's just metal and glass. You." His voice cracked. "You're all I've got left." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks. Mrs. Thompson finished bandaging her feet and quietly excused herself to the kitchen, leaving them alone. "I was so scared," Sarah admitted. "Not of him, of losing another piece of Mom." Marcus moved to the couch, pulling her into his arms. "Your mom lives in here." He tapped her chest. "In your heart, in your courage, in the way you look out for people. No one can steal that." Sarah buried her face in his uniform shirt. It smelled like concrete dust and sweat and safety. "But you know what you did wrong?" he asked softly. She nodded against his chest. "I broke all your rules. Don't investigate. Get to safety. Call for help. And don't try to be a hero." Marcus pulled back, looking into her eyes. Being a hero isn't about running toward danger. It's about doing the right thing, the smart thing, even when you're scared, like you do. A sad smile crossed his face. "I've got training, backup, and gear. You got bare feet and a dead phone." Sarah winced. "I forgot to charge it. We'll work on that." He touched the bandages gently. "No permanent damage, but you'll be sore for a few days." Mrs. Thompson returned with 3 mugs of hot chocolate. "Thought we could all use something sweet after all that excitement." They sat together, sipping their drinks, while outside other officers processed the scene. The sound of a power tool started up, someone beginning to repair the car window. "The man," Sarah said suddenly. "Who was he?" Marcus set down his mug. "Someone we've been looking for. He's hit a dozen cars in the area this month. But he won't be hitting any more." "Because I screamed? Because you were brave enough to call for help?" Marcus squeezed her shoulder. "That's what real courage looks like. Knowing when to alert others instead of trying to handle things alone." Sarah thought about that. About how her scream had brought the whole building running. About how Mr. Rodriguez had come with his bat, and Mrs. Thompson with her phone. Maybe her father was right. Maybe being a hero wasn't about fighting bad guys alone. Maybe it was about bringing people together when things got scary. The power tool outside went quiet. Through Mrs. Thompson's window, Sarah could see the Ford silhouette, whole again with its new window catching the streetlight's glow. It was still their car, still held their memories, but now it held a new story. One about a little girl who learned that the bravest thing you can do is ask for help when you need it. Detective Rivera's radio crackled in the parking lot. "Dispatch, suspect is secure. Evidence recovered. Need CSI at Granada Apartments." Sarah watched from Mrs. Thompson's window as more police cars arrived, their lights painting the brick walls red and blue. Her father stood by the Ford, talking to a man in plain clothes who was taking pictures of the broken glass. "Time to get you upstairs," Mrs. Thompson said, gathering their empty hot chocolate mugs. "Your daddy's got work to do." Sarah's bandaged feet throbbed as she stood. "Can I stay and watch?" "Police work isn't a TV show, child." Mrs. Thompson grabbed her house keys. "Besides, you've had enough excitement for one night." They stepped into the hallway just as 2 officers walked past, escorting the handcuffed man from the laundromat. Sarah pressed against the wall, her heart jumping into her throat. The man looked different now, smaller somehow. His dark jacket was torn at the shoulder. A bruise was forming under his right eye. He kept his head down as they led him past. "Head up," one of the officers ordered. "Watch where you're walking." The man looked up. His eyes met Sarah's. She expected him to look angry, mean. Instead, he just looked tired, defeated. "That's her," he said quietly to the officers. "The girl who screamed." The officers kept walking, but the man turned his head to keep looking at Sarah. "I'm sorry," he said. "About the car. I didn't know." "Keep moving." The officer cut him off, pushing him forward. Sarah's legs felt wobbly. Mrs. Thompson's arm went around her shoulders. "Don't you worry about him anymore," the old woman said firmly. "He's going where he belongs." They made it to the stairs just as Marcus came in from the parking lot. "Where are you two headed?" he asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Taking our hero home," Mrs. Thompson said. Unless you need her for anything official? Marcus shook his head. Rivera's got her statement. CSI might want photos of her feet for evidence, but that can wait till morning. My feet? Sarah looked down at the bandages. Those cuts came from glass at a crime scene, Marcus explained. Could be important for the case? Sarah hadn't thought about that. About how her bare feet running through the broken window glass might help put the man in jail. Does that mean I helped? She asked quietly. Marcus knelt down to her eye level. You did more than help, baby. You broke this case wide open. Rivera's been tracking this guy for weeks. Really? Really? He stood up, checking his watch. I've got another hour of paperwork, then I'm done. Mrs. Thompson, would you say no more? The old woman patted his arm. I'll stay with her until you're finished. They climbed the stairs slowly, Sarah wincing with each step. Her father's voice carried up from below, giving instructions to other officers. Inside their apartment, everything looked exactly as she'd left it. Math homework scattered on the table, windows still open to the night air. But it felt different now. Changed. Mrs. Thompson helped her to the couch. Let's elevate those feet. Doctor's orders. You're not a doctor, Sarah said, but she let the old woman pile cushions under her legs. I raised 5 children and helped with 12 grandchildren, Mrs. Thompson replied. That's better than medical school. Sarah smiled, then winced as pain shot through her feet. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving everything raw and achy. Mrs. Thompson, she asked, did I do the right thing? The old woman settled into the armchair across from her. Which part? Running barefoot through broken glass? That was foolish. Her face softened. But calling for help? Standing up for what's right? That's exactly what your mama would have done. I keep thinking about his face, Sarah admitted. When they walked him past us, he looked so normal. Bad people usually do. Mrs. Thompson's voice was gentle. That's why we have to look out for each other. Be each other's eyes and ears. Like her father always said. Like her mother used to do. Voices drifted up from the parking lot. Sarah could hear Rivera talking to someone. Perfect timing. If she hadn't alerted us... Tell me about your mom, Mrs. Thompson said suddenly. What would she think about all this? Sarah closed her eyes, picturing her mother's face. She'd be mad about me running downstairs. And proud that I didn't let fear stop me from doing what's right. Sarah opened her eyes. She always said being scared was okay, but letting fear control you wasn't. Mrs. Thompson nodded. Smart woman, your mama. She taught me to jump rope in that parking lot, Sarah said. Right next to the Ford. Said I had to practice every day if I wanted to get better. Is that why you're out there so much? Keeping your promise? Sarah shook her head. I'm out there because it feels like she's still there sometimes. When I'm jumping rope or sitting in the car or just watching from the window, Mrs. Thompson's eyes got misty. Oh, child, but Daddy's right, Sarah continued. She's not really in the car. She's in here. She tapped her chest like her father had done. In the way we look out for each other. Footsteps approached in the hallway. Heavy, familiar ones. Marcus appeared in the doorway, looking exhausted but relieved. Everything's wrapped up downstairs, he said. Windows fixed. CSI's done. Rivera's got enough evidence to put this guy away for a long time. Good. Mrs. Thompson stood. Then my work here is done. Unless you need anything else? Marcus shook his head. You've done more than enough, May. Thank you. The old woman bent to kiss Sarah's forehead. You rest those feet, hero. I'll check on you tomorrow. After she left, Marcus sat on the edge of the couch by Sarah's feet. How's the pain? Not too bad. It was a lie, but she didn't want him to worry more. Rivera wants to nominate you for a civilian commendation, he said. For helping catch a wanted criminal? Sarah's eyes widened. Really? Really? He carefully adjusted one of her bandages. But you know what means more than any award? What? You showed everyone in this building that one person can make a difference. That calling for help isn't weak. It's the strongest thing you can do. Sarah thought about her scream echoing through the parking lot. About how it had brought everyone running. Mr. Rodriguez with his bat, Mrs. Thompson with her phone, her father with his badge. We protect each other, she said. That's right. Marcus smiled. Just like your mom taught us. Outside, the last police cars were leaving. The parking lot settled back into its nighttime quiet, the Ford standing guard in its usual spot. Sarah felt her eyes getting heavy. The pain in her feet faded as exhaustion took over. "Daddy," she mumbled, "can we sit in the car tomorrow? Just for a little while?" "Of course, baby." He pulled a blanket over her. "We'll sit there as long as you want." As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah could have sworn she heard her mother's voice, soft and proud. "That's my brave girl." But maybe it was just the wind in the parking lot trees, standing guard over their memories, old and new. Morning light streamed through the apartment windows, catching dust motes in its beam. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her bandaged feet propped up on a chair, watching her father make pancakes. The events of last night felt like a dream, but the throbbing in her feet told her otherwise. "How many do you want?" Marcus asked, spatula poised over the griddle. "Two." Sarah shifted, wincing. "Are you sure I can't go to school today?" "Doctor's orders." Marcus flipped a pancake. "Besides, Rivera needs to take pictures of those cuts for evidence." The police radio on the counter crackled. Marcus had brought it home, keeping it on low volume. Every so often, they'd catch snippets about the man they'd caught. Processing, booking, investigation updates. "Is he really the guy?" Sarah asked. "The one who's been breaking into all the cars?" Marcus nodded, sliding pancakes onto a plate. "Found stolen items from 6 different vehicles in his apartment last night. Plus, he confessed to everything after we caught him. Because of me? Because of you." He set the plate in front of her. "The whole department's talking about it. The chief called this morning." Sarah poked at her pancakes with a fork. "Am I in trouble? With the chief?" Marcus laughed. "No, baby. He wants to give you an award." Before Sarah could respond, a knock at the door made them both turn. Marcus checked through the peephole before opening it. Detective Rivera stood in the hallway, holding a camera and a leather folder. "Morning, Johnsons. Ready for some paperwork?" Sarah straightened in her chair as Rivera entered. The detective looked different in the daylight, less intimidating without all the flashing lights and sirens. "How are the feet?" Rivera asked, pulling up a chair. "Sore," Sarah admitted. "I bet." "We counted 37 pieces of glass in that section of pavement." Rivera opened her folder. "Which is part of why I'm here. We need to document everything." Marcus leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Walk her through it, Annie." Rivera pulled out a form. "Okay, Sarah, I need you to tell me exactly what happened last night. Start from when you first saw the suspect." Sarah took a deep breath. "I was watching from the window, like I always do." "Why do you watch from the window?" "To protect Daddy's car." "Mom's car?" She glanced at her father. "Our car." Rivera nodded, writing. "And what did you see?" Sarah described everything. The man checking car windows, the tool in his hand, the sound of breaking glass. Her voice got shakier when she talked about running downstairs. "You were scared?" Rivera asked gently. "Yes." Sarah twisted her napkin. "But I was more scared of losing the car. Of losing Mom's things." Rivera's pen paused. She looked up at Marcus, who had turned away, his shoulders tight. "What happened next?" Sarah described her run down the stairs, her barefoot stand in the parking lot, her scream for help. Rivera wrote it all down, stopping occasionally to ask clarifying questions. "And that's when your father arrived?" "Yes." "Then the man ran, and Daddy caught him." Sarah hesitated. "Detective Rivera? Is it true he had a knife?" Rivera shared a look with Marcus before answering. "Yes, a pretty big one, which is why what you did was both very brave and very dangerous. But it helped catch him?" "It did more than that." Rivera set down her pen. "Sarah, do you know how long we've been trying to catch this guy?" Sarah shook her head. 6 weeks. He hit cars all over the city. Stole everything from spare change to college funds to personal documents. We could never catch him in the act because no one ever reported it happening. Because they were scared? Because they didn't think one person could make a difference. Rivera smiled. "You proved them wrong." A burst of static from the police radio made them all jump. "Suspect, processing complete. Detective Rivera, please report when available." Rivera pulled out her camera. "Let's get these photos done so I can head in. Can you show me your feet?" Sarah lifted her legs while Rivera photographed the bandages, then carefully unwrapped them to document the cuts underneath. The morning light made the injuries look worse, red lines crisscrossing her soles like a road map. "Almost done," Rivera promised, taking close-ups. The DA will want these for the case file. Will I have to go to court? Sarah asked. Probably not. Your father's testimony and these photos should be enough. Rivera lowered her camera. But there is something else you'll need to do. What? Come to the station tomorrow. Rivera grinned. The chief wants to meet you. Sarah's eyes widened. Really? Really? And wait till you hear what the department's planning. Marcus cleared his throat. Right, sorry. That's supposed to be a surprise. Rivera packed up her camera. But trust me, it's good. After Rivera left, Sarah sat quietly, picking at her cold pancakes. Marcus watched her from the counter. What's on your mind, baby? Did I do the right thing? She asked. Even though it was dangerous? Marcus pulled up a chair next to her. You did the right thing for the wrong reasons. What do you mean? Running toward danger. That was wrong. But calling for help, alerting others, bringing the community together. He squeezed her hand. That was exactly right. Sarah thought about that. About how her scream had brought everyone out of their apartments. About how Mr. Rodriguez and Mrs. Thompson had rushed to help. Like Mom would have done? Just like Mom? Marcus stood, collecting their plates. Speaking of which, want to go sit in the car for a bit? Rivera had them detail it after they fixed the window. Sarah's face lit up. Really? Really? They even found your mom's old air freshener in the glove compartment while they were cleaning. Still smells like vanilla. Sarah started to stand, then looked down at her bandaged feet. Marcus smiled. Don't worry. I'll carry you. He scooped her up like he used to when she was little, careful of her injuries. Sarah wrapped her arms around his neck as they headed for the door. Daddy? I'm sorry I scared you. Marcus paused, his hand on the doorknob. I know, baby. But you know what? What? I'm proud of you. Not for running into danger. Never for that. But for being brave enough to call for help. For showing everyone that one voice can make a difference. The hallway was quiet as they made their way down to the parking lot. Morning sun gleamed off the Ford's new window, making it shine like it had when they first bought it. Mom will be proud too, Sarah whispered. Marcus set her gently in the passenger seat, the leather cool against her legs. She already was baby, every single day. He closed her door and walked around to the driver's side. As he settled in, that familiar vanilla scent wafted from the glove compartment. Mom's signature fragrance, preserved like a memory in the car they'd all chosen together. Sarah closed her eyes, letting the morning sun warm her face through the new window. The fear from last night felt distant now, replaced by something stronger. The knowledge that sometimes the bravest thing isn't facing danger alone, but calling others to stand beside you. In the distance, a police siren wailed. But for once, Sarah didn't worry. She knew now that for every bad guy out there, there were more good people ready to help, ready to answer a call, ready to protect what mattered. All you had to do was be brave enough to ask. The police station buzzed with activity as Marcus led Sarah through the front doors the next morning. Her feet still hurt, but she'd insisted on walking. Officers stopped their conversations to watch them pass, some nodding, others smiling. Officer Johnson, a desk sergeant, called out. Chiefs waiting in the briefing room. Sarah gripped her father's hand tighter. She'd never been in the police station before, never seen where her father spent his days when he wasn't on patrol. The walls were lined with photos of officers, medals, and community awards. Nervous? Marcus asked, feeling her palms sweat against his. A little. Sarah tried to walk faster, but her bandaged feet wouldn't cooperate. What if I say something wrong? Just tell the truth. That's all anyone wants to hear. They reached a set of double doors marked briefing room. Inside, Sarah could hear multiple voices, chairs scraping against floor tiles, papers rustling. Marcus squeezed her hand. Ready? Before she could answer, Detective Rivera appeared in the doorway. There's our hero. Come on in, Sarah. Everyone's waiting. Sarah's legs felt wobbly as they entered the room. Her eyes widened at the crowd inside. At least 30 officers in uniform, plus several people in suits. At the front of the room stood a tall man with gray hair and a badge that sparkled under the fluorescent lights. Sarah Johnson, the man said, his voice filling the room. I'm Chief Wilson. We've been looking forward to meeting you. Sarah tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. The chief smiled, gesturing to an empty chair in the front row. Have a seat. Those feet must still be hurting. She sank into the chair, Marcus standing behind her. The room fell quiet as Chief Wilson moved to a podium. 2 months ago, he began, we started getting reports of car break-ins across the city. Professional jobs, clean entries, targeted items, no witnesses. The suspect hit during evening hours when most people were inside. He counted on fear, keeping neighbors quiet. The chief picked up a folder. In 6 weeks, he hit 47 vehicles, stole thousands in cash and valuables, left families feeling violated and afraid in their own neighborhoods. Sarah watched faces in the crowd harden at these words. Some officers nodded, others crossed their arms. Then, 2 nights ago, Chief Wilson continued, something changed. One person decided enough was enough. Not an officer, not a security guard, an 11-year-old girl who refused to let fear win. He turned to Sarah. Your father tells me you like to keep watch from your window. Is that right? Sarah nodded, finding her voice. Yes, sir, to protect our car. Tell us why that car is so important. Sarah glanced at her father before answering. It was Mom's too. Before she died, we picked it together. A soft murmur ran through the room. Chief Wilson's face softened. So, when you saw someone trying to break in, I had to do something, Sarah said. But I was scared. Being scared is normal, the chief said. What matters is what we do with that fear. Tell us what you did. Sarah described that night again. The man with the tool, the sound of breaking glass, her run down the stairs. This time, though, she focused on what her father had said was most important. I knew I couldn't stop him alone, she explained. So I screamed for help, as loud as I could. And what happened? Everyone came. Mr. Rodriguez brought his baseball bat. Mrs. Thompson called the police. Other neighbors turned on their lights and came outside. Chief Wilson nodded. You turned a bunch of scared individuals into a community looking out for each other. Do you know what happened after that night? Sarah shook her head. 3 other neighborhoods reported similar break-ins they'd been too afraid to call him before. Your courage gave others courage. He lifted a paper from the podium. The suspect confessed to everything. Said, and I quote, when that little girl screamed, I knew it was over. People weren't going to be scared anymore. Sarah felt her father's hand on her shoulder, squeezing gently. That's why we're here today, the chief continued. Not just to recognize your bravery, but to learn from it. You showed us something we sometimes forget in law enforcement, that the strongest weapon against crime isn't a gun or a badge. It's a community that stands together. He motioned to Detective Rivera, who stepped forward holding a wooden plaque. Sarah Johnson, on behalf of the Detroit Police Department, I present you with this civilian commendation for exceptional courage and community service. Rivera handed her the plaque. Sarah ran her fingers over the engraved words, her vision blurring with tears. But that's not all, Chief Wilson said. Detective Rivera, would you like to share the department's decision? Rivera stepped up to the podium, grinning. Sarah's actions helped us solve dozens of cases. The money recovered will be returned to victims. But there was also a reward posted for information leading to an arrest. She pulled an envelope from her jacket. The department voted unanimously to award that money to a special fund, the Sarah Johnson College Scholarship Fund. Sarah's head snapped up. Behind her, she heard her father's sharp intake of breath. To replace what was almost stolen, Rivera explained, and to ensure that courage like yours has a chance to grow. The room erupted in applause. Sarah felt her father's arms wrap around her shoulders, felt his tears drop onto her hair. That's not all. Chief Wilson raised his voice over the clapping. Starting next month, we're launching a new community watch program, teaching neighbors how to look out for each other, how to report suspicious activity, how to turn fear into action. He smiled at Sarah. We're calling it the Guardian Program, because sometimes the best guardians aren't the ones with badges. They're the ones brave enough to call for help when it's needed. The applause grew louder. Officers stood, some wiping eyes, others nodding firmly. Sarah clutched her plaque, overwhelmed by it all. A voice called from the back, "Speech! Let's hear from our guardian." Sarah looked up at her father in panic. Marcus knelt beside her chair. "You don't have to if you don't want to," he whispered. But Sarah was already standing, her bandaged feet carrying her to the podium. Chief Wilson adjusted the microphone for her height. The room went quiet, waiting. Sarah took a deep breath. My mom used to say that being scared was okay. She began, her voice shaking. But letting fear stop you from doing what's right wasn't. Heads nodded around the room. I was really scared that night. But I was more scared of losing something important. Not just the car, but what it means. How it reminds us to look out for each other. She looked at her father, standing proud in his uniform. Mom taught me that. Daddy teaches me that every day. And now I know something else: we're stronger when we work together. When we help each other. When we're not afraid to ask for help. Her voice grew stronger. That's what community means. That's what family means. And that's what being a guardian means. The room erupted again, louder than before. Officers stood, clapping and cheering. Sarah saw tears on more than a few faces. As her father helped her back to her seat, Chief Wilson returned to the podium. Remember this day, he told his officers. Remember what this young lady taught us? About courage, about community, about what it really means to protect and serve. Sarah sat quietly, holding her plaque, listening to the chief outline the new Guardian program. Her feet still hurt, but somehow it didn't matter anymore. Because now she understood being a guardian wasn't about standing watch alone. It was about bringing people together, about turning fear into strength, about knowing when to ask for help, just like her mother had taught her, just like her father showed her every day. And now, thanks to one scary night and one loud scream, she'd helped teach that lesson to others. A week after the ceremony at the police station, Sarah sat in the Ford's passenger seat, watching the sun rise over the parking lot. Her father had the early shift, but instead of heading straight to work, he'd suggested they sit in the car for a few minutes. Feet feeling better? Marcus asked, running his hand over the new steering wheel cover he'd installed. Almost healed, Sarah wiggled her toes in her sneakers. The cuts had scabbed over, leaving thin pink lines that Dr. Martinez said would fade with time. Good? Marcus reached into his pocket. Because I've got something to show you. He pulled out a small keychain, silver, with a guardian angel charm hanging from it. What's that for? Sarah asked. For this. He pulled out another key, newly cut, gleaming in the morning light. It's for the car. Sarah's eyes widened. Really? Really? He placed both in her palm. Yours guardian now, too. Officially, the metal felt warm against her skin. She ran her finger over the ridges of the key, then touched the angel charm. The whole building's different now, she said quietly. Did you notice? Marcus nodded. In the week since the break-in, changes had swept through Granada Apartments. Mr. Rodriguez had organized a residents' meeting to discuss the new Guardian program. Mrs. Thompson had started a phone tree for reporting suspicious activity. Even the teenage boys who used to loiter in the stairwells had joined in, volunteering to walk elderly residents to their cars at night. Rivera says car break-ins are down 60% citywide, Marcus said. People are watching out for each other now, calling things in. Because of me? Because you showed them how. He checked his watch. Speaking of which, Sarah followed his gaze to the building's entrance. Mrs. Thompson was emerging, wearing a bright yellow vest with Community Guardian printed on the back. The old woman had volunteered to coordinate the morning watch shift. Morning Johnsons, she called, waving as she set up her folding chair in her usual spot. Other residents were appearing too, collecting in small groups, checking on cars, greeting each other by name. Your mom would love this, Marcus said softly. Seeing everyone come together like family. Sarah clutched the key and charm. Do you think she'd be proud? Really proud? Baby, she was always proud of you. But this. He gestured to the busy parking lot, the neighbors checking on each other, the new sense of community. This would make her prouder than anything. A knock on the window made them both jump. Detective Rivera stood outside, grinning. Thought I'd find you two here, she said as Marcus rolled down the window. Got some news about the college fund? Sarah sat up straighter. The scholarship fund had been all over the local news, with community members and businesses adding donations to the original reward money. How much? Marcus asked. Rivera's grin widened. Enough to cover 4 years at any state school. Plus books. Sarah's mouth fell open. Marcus grabbed the detective's hand through the window. Annie, I don't know what to say. Thank the community, Rivera said. Once people heard the story, donations started pouring in. You got a lot of guardian angels out there, Sarah. Sarah looked down at the charm in her hand. Like Mom? Exactly like your mom? Rivera checked her phone. Marcus, we should head in. Chief wants to brief everyone on the Guardian program rollout. Marcus nodded, then turned to Sarah. Wanted to walk you up? No. She held up her new key. I think I'll sit here a little longer. Watch over things. He smiled, understanding. Mrs. Thompson's right there if you need anything. I know, Daddy. She leaned over to hug him. I'm not scared anymore. After Marcus and Rivera left, Sarah stayed in the car, watching the morning unfold around her. The key and angel charm felt right in her hand, like they'd been waiting for her all along. A group of kids walked past, heading to school. They waved to Mrs. Thompson, who checked them off on her clipboard. Mr. Rodriguez drove in from his night shift, parking next to the Ford. He did a quick check of both cars before heading inside. Sarah smiled, remembering something her mother used to say. Guardian angels come in all shapes and sizes. Sometimes they're right next to you, and you don't even know it. Now she understood what that meant. Every person in the parking lot was a guardian angel. Every neighbor watching out for strange cars. Every kid walking to school in groups. Every early morning greeting. They were all protecting each other. The sun climbed higher, warming the car's interior. Sarah closed her eyes, breathing in the familiar smell of leather and vanilla air freshener. The Ford wasn't just a car anymore. It was a symbol of everything her mother had taught her, everything her father stood for, everything their community had become. Her phone buzzed, a message in the new neighborhood watch group chat. Suspicious vehicle on Malcolm Street. Black sedan, no plates. Police notified. A minute later, patrol car responding. All clear. Then, thanks for the heads up. This is how we keep each other safe. Sarah typed her own message. Great job, everyone. Mom will be proud. Responses flooded in. Red heart, guardian angels watching out. This is what community looks like. She slipped her phone back in her pocket, smiling. The parking lot had filled up now. Neighbors heading to work, kids to school, everyone moving with new purpose, new awareness. Mrs. Thompson waved from her post, and Sarah waved back. The old woman had become something of a neighborhood captain, coordinating watch shifts and maintaining the phone tree. This is your mom's legacy, Marcus had said last night. Not just the car, but the way you brought people together. The way you taught them to be brave. Sarah ran her fingers over the guardian angel charm one more time before slipping it and the key into her pocket. She had homework to finish, but she'd do it by the window, keeping watch over her father's car, her mother's memory, their community's new beginning. Because that's what guardians did. They watched. They protected. They brought people together. As she climbed out of the car, Sarah noticed something she hadn't seen before. The morning sun hit the Ford's new window at just the right angle, creating a rainbow that stretched across the parking lot. Hi, Mom, she whispered, touching the glass gently. We're okay now. Everyone's looking out for each other. Just like you taught us. A breeze rustled through the lot, carrying the sound of neighbors greeting each other, of children laughing on their way to school, of a community awakening to its own strength. Sarah locked the car with her new key, the click echoing with finality. She wasn't just Sarah Johnson anymore. She was a guardian, a protector, a symbol of what one brave voice could accomplish. And somewhere, she knew, her mother was watching, smiling, proud of the little girl who had turned fear into courage, isolation into community, and one old Ford into a beacon of hope for an entire neighborhood. Because sometimes the bravest thing isn't facing danger alone, it's teaching others how to be brave together. That was her mother's legacy. That was her father's lesson. That was Sarah's gift to her community. And as she walked back to the apartment, key and angel charm jingling in her pocket, Sarah knew that this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning.